Ok. Bon. La vraie raison pourquoi vous êtes venu. So là, on switch en anglais. So now we switch to English. So today today's my last General Assembly actually, and so I think we couldn't have picked a better guest speaker for this General Assembly. The person you're about to meet is one of one of Hollywood's most prolific and successful producers. Steve Starkey has not only edited 3 films and assistant directed 7, but he's produced 22 films, and get this, that have generated, I don't even know if you knew this, Steve, according to my calculations, that have generated over $3 billion in aggregate worldwide box office. $3 billion. So Steve is one of the most successful producers alive today, and I think we're extremely lucky and privileged to have such an honored guest. So please join me in welcoming Steve Starkey. Welcome, Steve.
Should I test?
Yeah, you're fine. We can hear you great.
Okay.
So, wow, $3 billion. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, where did all that money go?
So we're going to get to that, but well, we're going to first, I think all these people here work in some form and another in the industry. Some are producers, visual effects, casting agents, finance, law. We really have a whole gamut of people. So I think, I'm going to try to find some common denominators between your experience, your career, and what interests them. And obviously, I think what interests everybody is how you got started, how somebody gets into this crazy profession, especially in the crazy city called Hollywood. So how did you get into this firstly?
Well, I had a passion for wanting to get into film, although I really didn't know how films were made. I had graduated from Berkeley. They didn't have a film program, and so I just went down to Los Angeles and just started looking around town to just see what I could do. And I found my way onto the Universal Studios back lot, and then just started going to sound stages and going up to people and saying, how do you do that? How does somebody get a job doing that? The first person that was receptive to my question was the electrical department, and I became a lighting technician at Universal, which I did for a few years. I got in the union and did that for a few years, and my wife was working in LA, and we decided, I don't know, this isn't quite right, so we moved back to Northern California, and then I got a job as a production assistant for George Lucas. Mm-hmm. And my whole career then shifted into getting groceries and picking up the newspaper for George.
That's how you started.
And that's how
the coffee boy.
Yeah, the errand boy.
Errand boy.
So that's how I started my career.
At ILM?
No, this was at Lucasfilm. This is where George maintained his offices. And they were just looking, there was just a company of like 5 people at that time. This was 1978. And I started doing that for him, and then I quickly realized that all the post-production on these films that were made in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, were edited there. So Francis Coppola was editing there, Phil Kaufman, and of course George, and they were big movies, but they were being made outside the Hollywood system.
Right, and you were referring to movies like Star Wars.
Yeah, so George had just finished Star Wars, and that's when I got hired working at his company. And I said to George one night, I'd really like to just learn something about editing, film editing. So the next day he said, this was like on a Saturday, he said, show up, and you're the new apprentice editor on More American Graffiti. And so I had to learn, and then became an assistant editor on Empire Strikes Back and on Jedi. And then started editing documentary films. And when I was doing the documentary on the making of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Spielberg said, I want that editor to come and work in my new company called Amblin. So then I went, and that started my next little, because I was with George for 6 years. Then I went down to LA and started working with Spielberg and met who became my mentors, Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall, who were then the producers for Spielberg. And as I was moving around in these early stages of learning about film, I said, I really want to do what they do. I want to just sort of oversee and be a part of what everybody does in making movies. And so then Frank kind of put me on a path to get into that position.
So
That's kind of how it
that's
started,
the
I
secret. You got to have two mentors, George Lucas and Spielberg.
Yeah, I was lucky, I guess, in that regard.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you met Lucas, you know, he hadn't even done American Graffiti yet, so.
No, he had done American Graffiti. He had just finished Star Wars.
So then everybody in the planet would have wanted to work for him by then.
Yeah, but he just had a little office. There were, I thought, it turned out what I thought you needed to work for George at that time, me as a production assistant, which was the lowest on the totem pole, is you needed your first name and last name to have the same initial. Because at that time, there was Steve Starkey, Laurel Latimer, Dwayne Dunham, Howie Hammerman, Ben Burt. So I figured that's the reason I got hired, because I had the right first and last initial.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, we're gonna get to Spielberg in a little while, but you know, after you worked in the Star Wars, it seems that, and you're gonna explain to us how you did it. One of the first movies you produced, perhaps that even you produced, was one of the biggest movies at that time, of all time, and he ends up winning an Oscar for Best Film, and I'm talking about, of course, Forrest Gump. How did that come together?
Well, there was a little bit of a road that, I didn't just do a documentary and then become a film producer of Forrest Gump, but when I worked for Bob Zemeckis on 3 films as an associate producer, Roger Rabbit and 2 sequels to Back to the Future. And during that time, we forged a pretty strong relationship. And then he took a bit of time off, and I was actually prepping a big movie for Spielberg, Jurassic Park. And it was during that time that Bob came to Steven as well. They were quite close, and said, I'd like to hire Steve as my producer. Mm-hmm. And this was on a film called Death Becomes Her. Mm-hmm. So after I finished that film, it was then, Forrest Gump then became our next film together. So it was really the 5th movie I did with Bob, but.
As producer?
No, the second as producer, but the 5th movie I worked on with
Bob.
Yeah. And so it was starting with Death Becomes Her that I forged this relationship with Bob, and I've been working on his films ever since, which I think accounts for all of this box office that you're talking about, that I don't know what happened to.
The money. But what's amazing about Forrest Gump, though, is it's very you had just started as your second film as producer, and you did not go the conservative way. I mean, Forrest Gump was an extremely risky project. I mean, it's a very linear story. It didn't have your traditional movie structure.
Right.
I mean, when you read the script and you knew what you were getting into, were you thinking, Christ, this could be the beginning of the shortest production career ever? Or did you have a vision? Did you know what was going to happen?
Well, I only knew a few things about Forrest Gump. One was it made you cry when you read it. And the second thing, and it was funny. It had irony. And it took place in the same period that I grew up in. So I really kind of thought, we're making this really emotional, beautiful movie for all my friends, because they all lived through this era and they're going to get it.
Right.
And that's kind of the way I looked at it. And it's funny, when you work with Bob, despite the fact I've worked with him many times, he takes films to a level that you really can't visualize. At least I can't. I mean, I think it would be akin to just being next to a wonderful artist painting, and you look at the model and, you know, and get a sense of what they're gonna try to do, and then the work they create is on a completely different level, you know, and with Bob, I mean, I have a pretty strong feeling of what we're gonna do, but like in the case of Forrest Gump, I had no idea that it was gonna go, it was gonna be as beautiful and as moving as it was, even though it was very moving reading it and thinking about it, you know, and wanting to make it, you know, you wanted to make it, but.
And then all the success that came with it, and that was the '94 Academy Awards, and I believe you were the very last person of the ceremony to give the speech.
Yeah, that was kind of daunting, you know, you know, first of all, it's like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, you know, who were standing there, and first of all, I was kind of overwhelmed by them, you know, because The Godfather is, those movies are probably, if not my favorite films, they're icons. So I was, and then when you stand there and you kind of do a first glance, you have an out-of-body experience about who these people are, and they're also all the people that, you know, you revere. And then it's just little you know, going, oh, you know, thanks. You know?
Well, I saw your speech on YouTube, it was very good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but you know, you just said The Godfathers were your favorite films, and you know, you began your career working right next to where Coppola was, I guess.
Yeah, it was really fun in those days, because all the movies that were getting edited in the Bay Area, we all traded, you know, techniques and went to each other's screenings and attended dinners together, and it was a very close community of filmmakers, and people weren't pigeonholed in the jobs they did. You spread out and you got to learn techniques for doing everything in film. And one of the wonderful get-togethers that you had in the Bay Area, Walter Murch, who's one of the great sound designer editors and who works, he had what was called the Droid Olympics. And the Droid Olympics was put on for all the people working in editing. And it was a competition doing very strange editing room techniques. Okay. Like, you take a little film core in those days. Of course, no one these days knows what a film core is because it's all digital, but I was working on with film, that archaic thing. And so you get a film core, and you used to, in the editing room, you wind the film up on the film core just by moving your hand. But his event was he stretched the film out, and you had to use your worst hand and do the same thing. So everybody was just trying to get them. Anyway, the Droid Olympics.
And you won.
I don't think I ever won any event, but I did participate.
But you know, you're talking about new techniques in this.
Oh, but I wanted to tell you what Francis is.
Yes.
So this was Francis. So he made up something, and he said, okay, starting right this second, everybody, you have to come up with an idea for a script, you have to finance it, you gotta shoot it, you gotta release it, and whoever does that first wins. And then he said, go. And then he went into the kitchen and made a big pasta dinner.
Excellent. Did you ever work with Francis Ford directly?
No,
I
didn't. No, I didn't. But
it's never too late. He was here.
Well, yeah, maybe I can go work at his winery.
Yeah. But you're talking about this, these different techniques. It nearly sounded like, you know, a production innovative laboratory where you're learning new techniques, and that might explain. If we can have the next slide. One thing we noticed about your films, Steve, is how eclectic and different they are. I mean, you know, look at that Back to the Future, you know, science fiction, and then live animation and real life, and Castaway, you know, one single actor, you know, and then Real Steel and everything else you've done. Where does this, it can't be accidental. This must be part of your choice process to always be pushing the envelope and trying something new.
Yeah, the pushing the envelope part, I think, just is akin with just what technique is required to get the movie made. It really wasn't like, you know, we have this innate, you know, affinity for new technology or something. It really springs from well, I really like this story about these cartoon characters who cohabitate with human beings. Well, how do we do that? And then that then becomes the springboard for designing new cameras and creating, the new technique for making these cartoon characters look like they live in the real world. And then that was a huge undertaking just to solve that. And, or in Back to the Future, when Bob would say, well, so I have this idea for a scene where Michael J. Fox plays his father and his sister. They're all at the dinner table at the same time. How do we do that? And then it's like, so you devise a thing which was the beginning of what we called then the Tondro system, but has become known now as motion control, which is just doing repeated actions with a camera that allow you to, as the camera keeps doing the same move, you can actually replace different elements within the frame on each pass, and then let different, different characters live in the same space. Each movie just seemed to require something different. And the wonderful thing is on these movies, they take you to new places that constantly require new techniques. I always feel like I start a movie and feel like I have no experience in making movies, because you start out and you're overwhelmed by how much you don't know. What you do know, you sort of take for granted. You don't worry about that, and you kind of don't think about that. So you do bring something to the party, I suppose. But what you do worry about is everything you don't know. I've never been to Montreal. I've never explored this city and making a film here. I don't know where, what stages they have. I don't know anything about wire walking technique and how you recreate that, and so it's a whole new journey that makes you feel like you've kind of never done anything. At least that's the way I always feel.
Well, we just had a General Assembly, and we were talking about we want to create Quebec's first media lab, as kind of an innovation incubator. You looking for a job?
No, not really. I'm actually looking for less work than more.
Okay, so we'll forget that.
Yeah.
One of the things, you were talking about Michael J. Fox and how in Back to the Future he plays all those great generations of characters, and if you can go to the next slide, it seems to be a thread in a lot of your films how the same actor plays multiple roles. I mean, John Malkovich in Beowulf, I remember, played father and son.
He did.
And then in Polar Express, Tom Hanks plays numerous characters.
Yeah.
Where does this come? And this is very innovative.
It's funny, Bob. It started strangely where Bob was trying to figure out. He was daunted by the idea of casting a boy to carry this whole movie. Although it's been done numerous times, with great success, but Bob was daunted by that. And also the motion capture, performance capture technique allowed you to have a great seasoned actor like Tom, one of the great actors in the world, portray a young boy in a way that maybe audience has never seen before. So that was the beginning of it. And then it was like, well, wouldn't it be cool if Tom was playing his father? And then that sprang to, well, we were thinking of getting Marlon Brando to play the hobo. And then Tom said, yeah, we can get him to do it and he started imitating Marlon Brando, and Bob's like, why do I need Marlon Brando? I got Tom Hanks can do a version of Marlon Brando and just create the character. And then it was the conductor. You mean like the conductor should be like, well, Tom, you could do the conductor. And then the next thing you know, Tom's doing like 6 roles. So it all came from this Bob-Tom collaboration and really Tom's ability, his great acting ability that allowed us to do that.
And was Beowulf one of your big? It was a huge movie, $150 million budget.
It was big, yeah.
And new style, new motion performance capture. That must be quite daunting.
It actually started. That technique started on Polar Express, and like I said, these techniques get born out of necessity. Right. And in that case, the movie was based on that cherished children's story, or, by Chris Van Allsburg. And Bob really wanted to create the movie to look like a Van Allsburg painting. And so we were just trying to figure out, well, do you shoot the movie live action and then you just like add this painterly texture to it? Like, how do you do this? And then Ken Ralston, who was then the visual effects supervisor at Sony, said, well, there is this new technique that they use in the medical profession and in golfing, where you can do this performance capture, where you can record the performance of someone, but in our case, we can create a digital character and envelop that around the performance. And we can try it. So we did a test. We did a green screen test, we did a live action test with the painterly thing, and then did performance capture. And we wound up using performance captures the way that we would make Polar Express. So on that, no one had ever done it, and we didn't know if it would really work, but it was a big, expensive movie, but we just kind of went for it.
Is that the same technique that Andy Serkis uses?
Yes.
Yeah.
Except at that time, like in his original Gollum performance, was not as fully evolved performance captures what we did. And in fact, Peter Jackson came, we had worked with him I had worked with Peter helping set up his effects place on the Frighteners. And we were in close contact with one another, and he came to see how we were doing what we did, and then evolved his technique.
On Polar Express.
Yeah, he saw what we were doing on Polar Express and then evolved it. And then also Jim Cameron, of course, all these people take the technique and then do it much better than we did, because they learned by our mistakes. And then
license.
Yeah, and then off they went,
Right. Before we get to the walk, I'm interested about how you finance, because I mean, everyone knows how difficult it is to finance a film, feature film production or TV series, but to finance something so experimental, so avant-garde, I mean, nothing like Polar Express had ever been done, Roger Rabbit, the same thing. Do you get involved in the financing of these projects? Or are I've pretty much worked in the studio system. So really what the challenge is fitting a movie in the box that they're comfortable with. It's not like I didn't have to go out and pre-sell movies, I didn't have to find outside financing. That was, I was working within the studio system, and they may have had to do that partially in order to finance the film, which happened on numerous, like even on Polar, it was partially independently financed by Shangri-La. But it wasn't my responsibility per se, it was more like they would go out into their world or decide their threshold, and then I had to fit in that box. But what's
But
interesting,
I had to sell it to them in the first place.
that's
The
what's
idea and the
interesting.
budget, and then they bless that, and then how their financing worked, I wasn't aware of.
What I'm interested is, how do you sell this to, because we all know, I mean, there's nothing more conservative than a studio major. I mean, sequels, franchises, they're not known for taking risks. A lot of these movies are extremely risky. Yeah.
Well, they've all had their tumultuous beginnings, where even this one, where the movie, not to segue into The Walk, but originally, The Walk was going to be a performance capture film. Because we had a company in Northern California which failed, or I should say was shut down anyway. And it was financed by Disney. And we had this idea, when the idea came up for The Walk, when Bob, once again, read a little book quite similar to the Polar Express, a small children's book based on the Philippe Petit's story of doing this walk between the towers of the World Trade Center. We actually thought at that time that it would be sort of a docudrama, and we would have Philippe Petit narrate the movie, and then we would digitally create Philippe as his younger self and get somebody to do the entire performance of the movie and take the audience back in time to 1974 and actually see that, and digitally recreate the entire world of 1974 in the computer. Well, that was an expensive movie, and it didn't, the company then went down, but we retained the rights to that project. And then it went through different iterations where it finally got to a place, because of its risky nature, where a studio finally said, okay, if you guys can do it like this, or for this price, then we'll finance the movie. But that took 8 years.
Wow.
So to get to today. So it took a long time, and a lot of different, okay, why don't we do it this way? That'll be this, well, what if we eliminate that and do it this way? And finally we got to this live action version here in Montreal, which has become affordable enough to do it.
And how much of the final incarnation of the walk is CGI?
Wow, how much, well, half of it.
Half of
Or
it?
something. You know, I mean, I'm not sure how to quantify that.
The reason I ask is because another thing I noticed is, more and more, producers and directors, if they have the choice between live and CGI, they're gonna go CGI for many reasons. But for anybody who saw this movie, The Flight, which Steve also produced, there's that crazy scene where Denzel Washington has to flip, what is it, a 737?
Yeah, flip it upside down.
Flip it upside down. Well, anybody would think that was done in a computer. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, what I read is you actually seatbelted 100 actors and flipped that
We did, we
plane.
flipped the plane upside down. Well, we didn't flip an entire plane upside down. You can flip parts of a plane upside down, and then you digitally blend those sections of the plane together so they're all flipping in sync with each other. And we never went outside the plane. This terrifying plane crash was shot from inside the plane.
Right.
But the same company that, it was actually a brilliant effects supervisor who left our company when it folded and started his own tiny little company in the Bay Area. And his first film project with his little group of people was Flight. And I convinced the studio to go with it because I knew that how wonderful he was. And so after forcing me to take it to all the major effects companies, they settled on Atomic Fiction. And they are doing all the effects for The Walk, which is a huge leap beyond what they've done before.
But they've opened in Montreal.
Yeah, so what might be of interest to the people here is that, Kevin has his company in the East Bay, in the Bay Area. But the economics of this film forced him to set up a satellite company somewhere, and he chose Montreal to be the base of where he's now going to have a permanent satellite company that's going to relate to his smaller company in the Bay Area. And it came out of the making of this movie.
Interesting. And what were the decisional criteria for you guys to choose Montreal finally? Because I remember when we met Matt at Sony Pictures and he started talking to us about The Walk, Montreal wasn't even on his radar at that point. And that was only at the end of last year. How did that whole process happen so quickly, and why Montreal?
Well, it really started, usually locations are driven, at least they're driven creatively. So, our story, our character starts in France and in Paris and in the countryside, and then eventually to pursue his dream, he comes to New York. So we needed to portray 1970s Paris and New York in our movie. And it was going to be laden with visual effects because the World Trade Centers, of course, don't exist. And so that's our alien environment, if you will. That's something that had to be created entirely digitally. So a lot of things came together where creatively the environment here was perfect as a hub to do both, unless you were a larger scale movie that could in fact go to Paris and go to New York. And so it started with that creatively, and then of course the economics of now the box we were put in to make the movie required us to seek out the best economics that work, for our budget. And the incentives that were provided to us here, just to come here and film, added a lot. Now all of a sudden, Montreal is starting to become a smarter place to go. And then, on top of that, well, this is a gigantic effects movie. So on top of that, we now have, we get to take advantage of the fact that we have incentives to do visual effects work here. And you compound all these things, and it drove us quickly to realize this is really a perfect fit for the walk. And it was a combination of all those things.
And this, as you know, and this is a question everybody's waiting for me to ask, is as you know, Quebec recently passed its new budget, and there was across-the-board reduction of 20% across all tax credits. You obviously are grandfathered into the old regime, but what do you, as a Hollywood producer, what is your prognosis? How is that 20% cut for Quebec, in Quebec, going to affect our attractiveness for further productions like yours?
Well, I think if people use the same criteria that I did, it's still gonna be very competitive. You still, even with the reduction, I couldn't shoot this movie in Georgia, or Louisiana, or North Carolina, or New Mexico, all these places in the United States that offer, or London, so there's still gonna be great incentive if you're making a movie that has some of the urban, things that you're looking for artistically. And, but in addition to that, still with an incentive to come here to do visual effects work. It's not just now Canada is not just a place where you do, gain economically for, going there, but the talent pool now is growing, which is crucial. And so there's a lot of effects companies here, not only doing visual effects, but doing 3D conversions, and both here and in Vancouver, and but that will also, if people are doing large-scale visual effects movies, they're still going to give it, they're going to give it consideration. So I don't think that, that reduction probably took a lot of other, now they have to compete a little more, because now the playing field's getting a little more equal, whereas you really stood out as having the greater incentive. But it's certainly, people are gonna have to give it serious thought still.
Good. That's good to hear. I'd like to open up the, if you're okay with this,
Yeah, sure.
to Q&A. We have a few minutes left. Take advantage while we have Hollywood's riskiest producer ever. Go ahead. Anyone have a question?
What's next?
There we go.
What's next for you?
Well, we have a lot of other risky projects, so it's hard to say, we have numerous things in development, and it's funny, what triggers the next project. Most of the projects we make are driven by my partner, Bob Zemeckis. And he, as he did on this film, he wrote The Walk, and he is a writer-director, although numerous times he hasn't taken credit as the writer. But he's written a few projects that just haven't quite gelled with all the things that need to gel, whether it's financial, getting the right actor, timing. There's just, so we don't have anything. The direct answer is we have nothing lined up to be next when this is finished. We have a lot of things that are at the stage where they could be next.
And maybe you have time to do Media Lab.
Yeah, right. Well, this, because of these visual effects, it's gonna take me another year to finish, but.
And 20 films, what's the average incubation period? I mean, you were saying The Walk took 8 years to get made.
Yeah, well, it did, like Forrest Gump, it took about 6 years. Some of the movies, gosh, they take a lot longer than you think. It's very rare, somebody just writes a script, it gets, you shop it around, and boom, someone says, let's make it, you go. It just it doesn't happen, you know, and usually, you know, I don't know in the incubate, you know, that period, how much you include the time the writer spends writing it, rewriting it, developing it, or whatever, you know, like on Flight, the last picture, it took 6 years, but for us, it took like 5 months. Because the writer wrote for many years, it evolved as a screenplay, and then they, sent it to Bob and Denzel Washington, similar time. And as soon as you have Bob saying, I wanna do it Denzel, well, this movie that had, the writer wanted to direct, but couldn't quite pull the players together. As soon as it went to Bob and Denzel's, now it's like on the fast track. It was just people said, okay, what's the budget, get that right, let's go.
You know, we had Mark Gordon here a few months ago, and Mark was explaining how he heavily gets involved in the development process. Do you do that as well?
It depends. You know, like on Polar Express, it was a very, it was a development process that included a lot of people around the table. Because the storybook had an outline for a movie, but it was only like 15 drawings long, and it had to be stretched out. So Bob would write, and we had conceptual artists drawing and storyboard artists storyboarding every scene, and it became a tabletop writing process, kind of akin, I guess, to the way animation is done in a strange way. In some cases, I'm involved only that I'm reading as Bob and a writing partner are writing. So it's just as a sounding board as opposed to, I'm not sitting in the room, you know, in writing sessions per se, except occasionally, you know, it's really Bob and his writer. Or Bob's just writing by himself, and then, you know, here's the next 30 pages.
Right.
That kind of thing, read these, you know.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm involved in that, I'm there through the whole period, and the degree of my involvement changes from movie to movie.
So to answer John's question, your next film is probably already in the incubation stage, or getting.
Yeah, it's already written. We have numerous scripts that actually we think are evolved, that they should get made, but we haven't convinced everybody else of that yet.
That's the key. Other questions? Yes.
What's next in terms of storytelling and multimedia, multi-platforms, whatever the medium is, and all the shebang that comes up with all the screens connected to everyone? What will be the impact on storytelling from your point of view?
Gosh, you know, that's a difficult question. I can't really see into the future that well, but I know that different storytelling techniques over time, like interactive storytelling techniques, have failed. And so the medium that we have, this sort of evolution of telling a story around a campfire style film where people enjoy just having stories told to them, that's the medium that I know and understand and love. And to tell you the truth, I don't quite relate to the other new technology techniques of storytelling. I don't know which ones of those are gonna all of a sudden engage people, where it's gonna supersede what we do, you know, this technique. So I don't know. I don't know what that's gonna be.
Any other questions? We have time for one more question.
I'm off the hook.
I know they're gonna ask you that. Oh, by the way, Steve cannot stay for the cocktail, so if you were planning on asking for the cocktail. Yeah. Well, okay, then, we have 30 seconds left, so we know your favorite film is your favorite film The Godfather?
Don't they always say it's like choosing your favorite child? I mean,
Okay,
it's among my favorites.
How many children? 3 children? Your 3 favorite films? 3 favorite films of all time?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would put The Godfather's gotta be among them, and I can't, you know, claim to say what the other 2 are.
Star Wars and Force.
Godfather 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
favorite actor you worked with?
well, I've worked with Tom Hanks the most, so he would probably qualify, but for multitudes of reasons, he's a special person and performer, but I've liked a lot of them, you know.
Best experience you had?
Yeah, best experience. I don't know, they're all life experiences, so I can't choose one as being the best, I suppose.
That's a cop-out answer.
It is.
Okay, then, here's a last question. Will you come back to Montreal?
Oh, yeah, I mean, whether I come back for, making a movie or not, I mean, I've been inundated by the festivals here, and so it would be a lot of fun to take advantage, although I have to admit, I've taken advantage of this city in an extraordinary way, despite the fact I'm working. I've gone to more festivals here than in my entire life. But it has been wonderful, and I think I've eaten better food than I've eaten traveling anywhere in the world by just staying right here in Montreal. It's just great, so it's probably a great place just to come and just eat and go to festivals.
Great place.
And not make movies or all this stuff.
Well, it's a great place to live.
Well, I imagine it must be, yeah, it would be great.
Media Lab?
I just don't know where to do
Okay, we have
Good luck with your next